The rain came down in sheets that November night in 1847, turning the red clay roads of the Whitmore plantation into rivers of mud. Elijah worked by lamplight in the carpentry shed, his calloused hands moving with practiced precision across a piece of oak destined to become a cabinet door. At 32, he had spent half his life on this land, his fingers knowing its wood better than they'd ever known freedom. The door to the shed burst open. Samuel, the house servant, stood breathless in the doorway, rain dripping from his livery. "Master wants you up at the big house. Now. Something about the main staircase." Elijah set down his plane carefully, wiping the shavings from his hands. His heart maintained its steady rhythm. Panic was a luxury he'd trained himself not to afford. "This hour?" "Mistress slipped on it this afternoon. Master's in a rage. Says if it ain't fixed by morning, somebody's gonna pay." Samuel's eyes held a warning they both understood. In Thomas Whitmore's world, payment always came in flesh. The walk to the manor house seemed longer than usual, each step through the driving rain a meditation on survival. Elijah had learned the rules early. Keep your eyes down, your words few, your movements deliberate. Never run. It suggested guilt or escape. Never stare. It implied defiance. Never, ever forget that you weren't human in their eyes, just property that happened to breathe. The back entrance to the manor glowed with lamplight. Elijah removed his soaked hat and entered through the servant's door, tracking mud despite his care. The house smelled of beeswax and tobacco, wealth compressed into scent. He'd been inside perhaps a dozen times in 15 years, always to fix something, always reminded by his presence that this beauty was built on backs like his. Margaret Whitmore stood at the base of the grand staircase, her silk dress the color of cream, her blonde hair pinned in the latest fashion from Charleston. She was perhaps 28, beautiful in the way of hothouse flowers, delicate, expensive, and utterly divorced from soil and sun. Her hands clutched her skirts as she looked up at the offending step. "The third tread," she said without looking at him. "It shifted beneath me. I nearly fell." "Yes, ma'am." Elijah kept his gaze on the stairs, already assessing the problem. The tread had come loose from its riser, likely from the humidity. An hour's work, maybe 2. "My husband is away tonight. In Savannah, conducting business." Her voice carried an edge he couldn't identify. Not quite fear, not quite relief. "He expects it repaired by his return tomorrow evening." "I'll see to it, ma'am." Elijah retrieved his tools from the shed and set to work. The house settled around him in its nocturnal rhythms, the tick of the grandfather clock, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through ill-fitted windows. He worked methodically, removing the damaged tread, planning the replacement, measuring twice because there would be no second chance. Margaret appeared and disappeared like a ghost, sometimes watching from the parlor doorway, sometimes ascending to the second floor, her footsteps soft on the carpet runner. Near midnight, she brought him water in a crystal glass, a gesture so unexpected that his hand trembled as he took it. "Thank you, ma'am." "What's your name?" she asked suddenly. He looked up before he could stop himself, meeting her eyes for a fraction of a second before dropping his gaze. "Elijah, ma'am." "How long have you been here, Elijah?" 15 years, ma'am. Since I was 17. "And before that?" He didn't answer. Before was a word that could break a man. Before meant a mother's arms, a father's laugh, a sister's songs. Before meant being torn from a Virginia farm and sold south, watching his family disappear in a cloud of dust. Before meant a wife named Sarah and a daughter named Grace, sold away to pay Thomas Whitmore's gambling debts 3 years ago. Before was a life that no longer existed except in the dreams that woke him, gasping in the night. "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. "I shouldn't have asked." The clock struck 1. Elijah fitted the new tread into place, testing its stability. Solid. Safe. He began gathering his tools. "You're not leaving tonight." The words froze him mid-motion, not a question, not quite a command, something in between, something that made his blood run cold, despite the summer-thick air inside the house. He straightened slowly, tools still in his hands. "Ma'am, the work is finished." "I know." She stood at the top of the stairs now, looking down at him. In the lamplight, her face seemed pale as bone. "But you're not leaving." Every instinct screamed danger. This was how men died, not from defiance, but from being caught in situations they had no power to control. If anyone saw him here alone with her, if any servant spread rumors, if Thomas Whitmore's even suspected, it wouldn't matter what had or hadn't happened. The accusation itself was execution. "Ma'am, Do you know what it's like?" she interrupted, descending the stairs with a rustling of silk. "To live in a house full of people and be utterly alone, to speak and never be heard, to be seen but never known." Elijah kept his eyes fixed on the floor. "I should return to the quarters, ma'am." "You can't." Her voice sharpened. "Don't you understand? I'm telling you that you can't leave." The tools felt heavy in his hands. He set them down carefully, buying time to think. In the silence, he could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. This wasn't Isaiah, he realized. This was something far more dangerous. This was desperation wearing the mask of power. "With respect, ma'am," he said carefully, "you don't want me here. How dare you tell me what I want?" But her voice cracked on the last word. He made a decision then that might have been bravery or might have been the only truth he had left. He lowered himself to his knees on the floor, head bowed, hands open at his sides. Not submission exactly, but something older, a refusal to play the game she was trying to start. "Madam," he said, the formal address deliberate, "I am not what you need." The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "How dare you? How dare you kneel to me like I'm something to be prayed to, like you have the right to refuse me anything." "I have no rights, ma'am. That's precisely the point." "Get out!" The words came sharp as a slap. "Get out before I scream, before I tell them you forced your way in here, that you—" But she didn't finish. They both knew the power of those unspoken words, how they could transform absence into assault, silence into violence. Elijah rose slowly, gathered his tools, and walked to the door. He paused at the threshold, not looking back. "Madam," he said quietly, "I hope you find what you're looking for. But it isn't here. It never was." The rain had stopped. He walked back to the slave quarters under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, stars sharp as broken glass overhead. Inside the cabin he shared with 4 other men. He lay on his narrow pallet and stared at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. He knew with the certainty of 15 years' survival that something had shifted tonight, some balance had tipped, and there would be consequences. He just didn't know yet what form they would take. Dawn came too early, as it always did, announced by the plantation bell that called them to the fields. Elijah rose with the others, his body moving through the morning routine while his mind remained fixed on the night before. In the gray light filtering through the cabin's cracks, he studied the faces of his companions. Men worn down by labor and loss, their spirits bent but not quite broken. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said Moses, an older man who worked the cotton gin. "Something happened last night? Fixed the staircase in the big house." Elijah kept his voice neutral. "Took longer than expected." Moses grunted but said nothing more. In their world, questions could be as dangerous as answers. The morning passed in familiar rhythms. Elijah worked in the carpentry shed, repairing tools and constructing a new cotton press. His hands moved automatically while his mind turned over the previous night like a puzzle missing pieces. Margaret's desperation had been real, but what had driven it? And more importantly, what would she do now that he'd refused her? Not with words exactly, but with something that might have been worse in her eyes. Dignity. At noon, Samuel appeared again, his face carefully blank. "Master's back early. Wants to see you up at the house." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of dread spreading outward. Around the shed, other workers found reasons to be busy, to not meet his eyes. They all recognized the summons for what it likely was. Thomas Whitmore waited on the veranda, a glass of whiskey in one hand, despite the early hour. He was a large man, thick through the shoulders and belly, his face florid from too much sun and too much drink. At 45, he ruled his plantation with the certainty of someone who'd never been told no, never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Elijah. He didn't invite him up the steps, didn't offer any courtesy. "My wife tells me you were in the house last night, past midnight." "Yes, sir. Repairing the staircase as ordered." "And during this repair work, did you speak to Mrs. Whitmore?" The trap was already set. Any answer could be twisted. "Only about the work, sir. What needed fixing?" Thomas took a long drink, ice clinking in the glass. "That's interesting. Because she's been in her room all morning crying. Won't say why, won't even come down for breakfast." His eyes narrowed. "Now why would that be?" "I couldn't say, sir." "Couldn't? Or won't?" Thomas set down his glass with deliberate care. "I've owned you for 15 years, Elijah. Paid good money for you. You've been reliable, I'll give you that. Never caused trouble, never tried to run. But last night, something happened in my house that upset my wife, and I mean to know what." Elijah kept his gaze fixed on a point past Thomas's shoulder. To look him in the eye would be defiance. To look down would be guilt. So he looked at nothing, let his face become a mask. "The staircase was repaired, sir. That's all that happened." "That's all?" Thomas descended the steps slowly, deliberately invading Elijah's space. He smelled of whiskey and pomade. "Because I'm wondering if maybe you said something, did something, maybe thought that because I wasn't here, because it was just you and her in that house, that you could forget your place." "No, sir." "No, sir?" Thomas mimicked. "Is that all you've got to say? Because I've got half a mind to have you whipped until you remember how to tell the truth." From the corner of his eye, Elijah saw Margaret appear on the veranda, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the warmth. Her face was indeed blotchy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed. When she saw him standing there, she went very still. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely carrying. "That's enough." "Enough?" Thomas turned to his wife. "The boy upset you so much you locked yourself away all morning, and you're telling me enough?" "He did nothing wrong." The words came out flat, mechanical. "I was overwrought. The near fall on the stairs shook me more than I realized. When he finished the work, I said something foolish. He behaved perfectly properly." Thomas studied his wife with the calculating gaze of a man used to reading livestock for weakness. "What did you say?" "It doesn't matter." "Tell me." "I told him," she faltered, then straightened her spine. "I told him he'd done good work, that I appreciated his craftsmanship, and he said thank you and left. That's all." The lie hung in the air, transparent to everyone present. But Thomas couldn't prove it false without calling his wife a liar, which would reflect poorly on him. The standoff stretched until finally he spat into the dirt near Elijah's feet. "Get back to work, and if I ever hear of you speaking to Mrs. Whitmore again for any reason, I'll sell you so far south you'll forget what winter feels like. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Elijah walked back to the carpentry shed, feeling the weight of eyes on him from every direction. Slaves working in the garden, servants visible through the house windows, the overseer leaning against a fence post, all had witnessed the confrontation. By nightfall, the story would have spread throughout the plantation, and with it, speculation and rumor. That evening, as Elijah sat outside the cabin eating his meager dinner, young Benjamin approached. At 19, Benjamin still carried hope like a barely healed wound, still believed escape was possible if you were clever enough, brave enough. "Is it true," Benjamin asked, sitting beside him, "that the mistress tried to—" "No," Elijah cut him off sharply. "Whatever you heard, it's not true. Nothing happened, but everyone's saying everyone's wrong. He turned to face the younger man. Listen to me. This is how it works. They create a story that fits what they want to believe, and the truth doesn't matter. The truth is dangerous. So you forget whatever you think you know, and you keep your head down. Understand? Benjamin nodded slowly, but doubt lingered in his eyes. That was the problem with hope. It made you think there were simple answers, clear villains and heroes. It took years to learn that in a system this rotten, everyone was both victim and perpetrator, everyone compromised, everyone stained. 3 days passed. Elijah worked, ate, slept, and said nothing to anyone. But he noticed the changes. The way other slaves gave him slightly more space. The way the overseers watched him more closely. The way Margaret never appeared on the veranda when he was within sight of the house. The plantation had absorbed the incident like a body absorbing poison, and now everyone waited to see what sickness would emerge. On the 4th night, Samuel came to the cabin after dark, which was itself unusual enough to raise alarm. He spoke in whispers, his voice urgent. There's talk. The master's been drinking heavy, asking questions. He's got it in his head something happened, and his wife's protecting you for some reason. You need to be careful. I'm always careful. Not careful enough. Samuel glanced over his shoulder. There's something else. The mistress has been different since that night. Stays in her room, barely eats. The house servants say she's been going through the master's papers, his ledgers, like she's looking for something. This news settled over Elijah like a shroud. Margaret, searching through accounts, could only mean one thing. She was looking for information about the slaves, about sales and purchases, about the machinery that kept this system running. The question was why. He got his answer a week later. The blow came not as Elijah expected, but worse. It came as fiction masquerading as truth, as rumor hardened into fact through repetition. It started with a whisper among the house servants. Elijah had been seen near the manor at odd hours. Then the whisper became specific. He'd been seen entering through a side door. Then, more specific still, he'd been heard arguing with someone inside. By the 3rd day, the story had crystallized into something darker. He'd been caught in Mrs. Whitmore's chambers, had assaulted her dignity, had forgotten his place in the most grievous manner. None of it was true. All of it was believed. Thomas Whitmore assembled the entire plantation workforce in the main yard at dawn. The slaves came from the fields, the house, the stables, forming a silent audience. The overseers stood with coiled whips, their faces hard with anticipation. And there, tied to the punishment post in the center of the yard, was Elijah. They'd come for him in the night. 4 men, not speaking, just dragging him from his pallet while the others pretended sleep. No trial, no questions. The decision had already been made. Thomas stood on the veranda, Margaret beside him like a pale statue. "Let this be a lesson," he called out, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "I am not a cruel master. I provide for you, clothe you, give you purpose. But I will not tolerate disrespect. I will not tolerate any man, slave or otherwise, who threatens the honor of this household." Elijah kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. His shirt had been stripped away, exposing his back, already scarred from a whipping years ago when he'd been caught with a forbidden book. The morning air felt cold against his skin, or perhaps that was just fear masquerading as temperature. "The offense," Thomas continued, "is clear. This man took advantage of my absence to force his presence on my wife, to speak to her inappropriately, to threaten her when she rejected his advances. The law in this state is clear. Such behavior from a slave is punishable by death." A murmur ran through the crowd. Death sentences were rare. Slaves were expensive property, after all. But they happened when an example needed to be made. Margaret swayed slightly, gripping the veranda railing. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words emerged. "However," Thomas said, "my wife has pleaded for mercy on his behalf. She believes he is mad rather than malicious, that he doesn't understand the gravity of his actions. So I will show restraint. 50 lashes, and if he survives, he'll be sold at the next market, sent so far away that none of you will ever see him again. The overseer approached, whip in hand. Elijah closed his eyes and thought of Sarah, of Grace, of the life that had been stolen from him piece by piece. If this was how it ended, at least it would end. At least the long, slow dying would finally be complete. The first lash fell like lightning, pain exploding across his back. He bit down on the inside of his cheek, tasting copper. He would not scream. That was the only dignity left to him, the choice of silence. But before the second blow could fall, Margaret's voice rang out clear and strong. "Stop!" Thomas turned to her, surprise written on his face. "Margaret, we discussed—" I lied. She descended the steps, her mourning dress rustling. Every eye tracked her movement. Everything I said was a lie. He never touched me, never spoke inappropriately, never threatened anything. "Margaret, you're overwrought. I'm telling the truth." She walked closer to the punishment post, close enough that Elijah could see her trembling. That night, after he fixed the stairs, I asked him to stay. I told him he couldn't leave, and he refused me, not with violence or disrespect, but by reminding me that he had no choice in the matter, that any decision I made for him was made under duress. The silence was absolute. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, harsh and mocking. Thomas's face went through several colors, red to purple to a kind of sickly white. "You asked a slave to— You expected me to believe." "I expected nothing." Margaret's voice steadied. I was lonely and foolish and cruel, and when he showed me more honor than I showed him, I was ashamed. So I said nothing and let the rumors grow because I was too much of a coward to stop them. She turned to face Elijah directly for the first time. "I'm sorry. That's inadequate, I know. Nothing I say can undo this. But you deserve to hear it from me. You did nothing wrong. Nothing." Elijah met her eyes, and in them saw something he hadn't expected. Not just guilt, but recognition. She understood finally what he'd tried to tell her that night, that in a system where one person could be property and another could own human flesh, there could be no honest interaction. Every word was coercion, every gesture a command, every silence enforced. Thomas descended the steps slowly, his hands clenched into fists. When he reached his wife, he raised one hand as if to strike her, then seemed to remember the audience. "Get inside," he hissed. "We'll discuss this privately." "No." Margaret stood her ground. "I won't let you punish him for my mistakes. If you want to hit someone, hit me. I'm the one who created this situation. You're hysterical. I'm clear-headed for the first time in years." She looked out at the assembled slaves, the overseers, the house servants. "Do you know what it's like to be married to a man who treats you like a prize horse, who parades you at parties but never asks your opinion, who spends your dowry on more slaves to work more land to make more money that you'll never see or control? Margaret, I'm not his wife. I'm another piece of his property, except I'm too valuable to whip." She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "At least he sees you as what you are," she said to Elijah. "With me, he pretends it's love." Thomas grabbed her arm roughly. "I said inside. Now." But she pulled free, and in that motion, something transformed. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I know where you keep your account books, Thomas. I know how much debt you're in. I know you've mortgaged our home 3 times over to buy more slaves, more land. I know about the loans coming due next month that you can't pay." Thomas went very still. "Give me that paper." "No." She held it out of reach. "This is a letter to my father's attorney in Charleston, detailing everything, your debts, your gambling, the plantation you claimed was profitable that's actually bleeding money. If anything happens to this man," she gestured to Elijah, If he dies or disappears, this letter gets delivered, and my father will call in every loan, foreclose on every debt. You'll lose everything." The tableau held. Margaret defiant, Thomas frozen, Elijah still bound to the post, and dozens of slaves watching a crack form in the foundation of their world. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You would destroy your own home, your own future." "I would destroy a lie. We have no home here, Thomas. Just a beautiful prison where we're all slaves to your ambition and pride." The sun climbed higher, heat building despite the early hour. Sweat ran down Elijah's back, mingling with blood from the single lash. His arms ached from being bound, but he didn't move, barely breathed. He was witnessing something unprecedented, a white woman openly defying her husband, threatening his financial ruin, all to protect a slave. It was madness. It was also, somehow, truth. Thomas looked around at the assembled crowd as if seeing them for the first time. "Everyone back to work," he ordered, his voice tight. "This matter is concluded." Slaves dispersed slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid the spell would break the moment they turned away. The overseers exchanged glances but said nothing. Even they understood this had moved beyond punishment into territory that touched the foundations of plantation society itself. "Cut him down," Thomas said to the nearest overseer. The man hesitated. "Sir?" "I said cut him down. Now." Rough hands freed Elijah's wrists. He stumbled, catching himself against the post. His shoulders screamed from being held in position for hours. Margaret moved toward him, but Thomas caught her arm. "Don't," he said quietly. "You've done enough." She wrenched free again. "Have I? Or have I finally done something true?" She addressed the overseer directly. "Take him to the carpentry shed. Let him rest. Make sure he has water." Thomas's jaw worked, but he said nothing. The power dynamic had shifted in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. His wife had just threatened to ruin him, and she'd done it publicly, which meant backing down now would make him look weak. But pursuing punishment would trigger the very consequences she'd outlined. He was trapped by his own system, caught between pride and pragmatism. Elijah walked back to the shed supported by Moses, who'd materialized at his elbow. They said nothing until they were behind closed doors. Then Moses rounded on him. "What did you do to that woman?" "Nothing, I swear it." "Then why would she risk everything for you?" Elijah sank onto a workbench, his head spinning. "I don't think she did it for me. I think she did it because she finally saw the cage she was in, and she needed to kick at the bars." Moses shook his head slowly. "That's noble thinking, but noble thinking gets you killed in this place." He was right, of course. Whatever Margaret's motivations, the outcome was uncertain. Thomas wouldn't forget this humiliation. Neither would the overseers or the other planters who would probably hear the story. Margaret had painted a target not just on herself but on Elijah as well. He'd become a symbol of something larger than himself, evidence that the system could be challenged, that slaves could have advocates, that white women could refuse to be complicit. That made him more dangerous than any runaway. The day passed in a strange suspension. Elijah remained in the shed, nominally working but mostly recovering. Slaves came and went, some bringing water, others just wanting to see the man who'd somehow survived Thomas Whitmore's wrath. Their faces held a mixture of awe and fear. Awe at the unprecedented intervention, fear at what it might mean for all of them. As sunset painted the sky orange and red, Samuel appeared at the door. He looked haggard, older than his 40 years. "The master and mistress been at it all day," he reported quietly. "Shouting, throwing things. She's packing bags. Says she's leaving, going back to Charleston." "She won't make it," Moses said from his corner. "A white woman traveling alone? Her family will just send her back." "Maybe, but she's trying." Samuel turned to Elijah. "She wants to see you, tonight, after the house is asleep. Says she has something to give you." "No." Elijah's response was immediate. No more meetings, no more conversations. That's what got us here. She says it's important. Life or death important. Everything here is life or death. Samuel stepped closer, lowering his voice. She's got the account books, the full ledgers showing who owns who, how much everyone cost, where people were bought from, names and ages and places. She says you need it. Elijah's heart stuttered. In his 15 years on the plantation, he'd tried to find out where Sarah and Grace had been sold. Every inquiry had been met with silence or punishment. The records were kept locked in Thomas's office, accessible only to him and his business associates. If Margaret really had copied those records. Why? He asked. Why would she risk more for this? She didn't say. Just that you'd understand when you saw. Elijah looked at Moses, who shrugged helplessly. Your choice, brother. But if you go, you might not come back. He was right. This could be a trap, Thomas setting a final snare, creating undeniable evidence of trespassing, of theft, of whatever crime would justify execution. Or it could be genuine. Margaret might truly have discovered something that mattered, something worth the danger. The question was whether he was willing to bet his life on which. As darkness fell and the plantation settled into its nighttime rhythms, Elijah made his decision, not because he trusted Margaret. Trust was a luxury slaves couldn't afford, but because the possibility of finding Sarah and Grace, of knowing where they were, of perhaps one day reaching them, was worth any risk. He'd been dying slowly for 3 years, ever since they were torn from him. If this was a faster death, so be it. He left the shed at midnight, moving through shadows he knew intimately. The big house glowed with lamplight in one upstairs window, Margaret's room. The main floors were dark, Thomas presumably already asleep or drunk or both. Elijah circled to the back entrance, the same one he'd used the night this all began. The door opened before he could knock. Margaret stood there in a simple dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her, but her eyes were steady, determined. "Come in," she whispered. "Quickly." He followed her to the library, where papers covered the desk. She'd been working for hours, he realized, copying documents, making lists, organizing information. In the lamplight, he could see her hands were stained with ink, her fingers cramped from writing. "I found her," Margaret said without preamble. "Your wife, Sarah." The world tilted. Elijah gripped the edge of the desk. "Where?" "Alabama, a cotton plantation outside Montgomery. She was sold with your daughter to a man named Henderson. They're still together, as far as the records show." She pushed a paper across the desk. "This is the address, the plantation name, everything I could find." Elijah picked up the paper with shaking hands. The words swam before his eyes. Sarah, Grace, together, alive. 3 years of not knowing, 3 years of imagining the worst, and here in black ink was proof they existed. "Why?" The word came out hoarse. "Why do this?" Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "Because that night, when you knelt on my floor and called me madam, you showed me what I really was, not a wife, not a person, just another piece of property that happened to have more privileges. And I realized," her voice caught, "I realized I could use those privileges, that being property with power meant I could choose what to do with it. This won't save you from your husband. I know, but it might save some of you." She gestured to other papers on the desk. "I've copied everything, purchase records, sales, family connections between slaves. I'm going to send it north, to abolitionists in Boston, so at least someone will have evidence of who belongs to who was separated, where they are, so that if this system finally falls, people can find each other again." Elijah stared at her, understanding dawning. "You're going to ruin him." "I'm going to try. Not just him, this whole rotten structure. I can't do much, but I can do this." I can be a crack in the wall. They'll come after you, destroy your reputation, say you're insane. Probably, but I'll be telling the truth. And sometimes, she met his eyes, sometimes telling the truth is the only power you have left. Outside, the dog barked. They both froze. Footsteps sounded on the floor above. Thomas moving around. The danger crystallized. If he came down, if he found them here together with these documents spread across the desk, there would be no mercy for either of them. Margaret moved quickly, gathering papers and shoving them into a leather satchel. You need to go. Now, take this. She pressed the bag into his hands. There's money inside too, not much, but enough to get you started if you decide to run. I can't run. The words were automatic, trained into him by 15 years of seeing what happened to runaways. They'll hunt me down. They might. But at least you'd have chosen something for yourself. At least you'd have tried. The footsteps overhead grew louder, heading toward the stairs. Margaret pushed him toward the door. Go, please. Don't let what I did be for nothing. Elijah went, the satchel clutched to his chest, his mind reeling. He made it back to the quarters without being seen, hid the bag beneath loose floorboards in the cabin, and lay on his pallet staring at darkness. Sarah was alive. Grace was alive. He had their location. And he had a choice. The first real choice he'd been offered in 3 years. Dawn brought Thomas Whitmore's wrath like thunder. The entire plantation woke to his roaring, his voice carrying across fields and cabins as he stormed through the house. By the time the slaves assembled for morning assignments, they all knew Margaret was gone. She'd left sometime before sunrise, taking a horse and riding north alone. No luggage, no money that Thomas knew about, just disappeared like morning mist. Thomas gathered the overseers, organized a search party, and then turned his fury on the remaining household. Someone helped her, he raged, pacing the veranda. Someone saddled that horse, opened the gate. Someone knew she was planning this. Samuel stood with the other house servants, his face carefully neutral. But Elijah, watching from near the carpentry shed, saw the slight tension in his shoulders. Samuel had helped. Maybe not with the horse, but with something. Information, perhaps. A warning. Thomas's gaze swept the assembled slaves and stopped on Elijah. You. The accusation needed no elaboration. Everyone understood. Whatever Margaret had done, Elijah would be blamed for it. He was the catalyst, the symbol, the convenient scapegoat. Come here. Elijah walked forward slowly, aware of every eye on him. Thomas descended the steps, and for a moment Elijah thought he would strike. But Thomas's rage was colder than that, more calculated. My wife is gone, he said quietly, his voice tight with control. And I think you know where she went. I think you've been helping her plan this for days, maybe longer. No, sir. Don't lie to me. Thomas grabbed Elijah's shirt, pulling him close. His breath smelled of whiskey despite the early hour. You did something to her. Poisoned her mind against me, against her home. What did you say to her that night? Only the truth, sir, that I was not what she needed. The answer clearly wasn't what Thomas expected. He released Elijah roughly, stepping back. What does that mean? It means she was looking for someone to see her as a person. And I reminded her that I couldn't do that because I'm not allowed to see anyone as a person. Not even myself. Silence fell. The other slaves shifted uncomfortably. This was dangerous talk, words that could be interpreted as philosophy or defiance, either of which could get a man killed. Thomas studied Elijah with narrowed eyes. You think you're clever, using words like weapons, but let me tell you something about words. They don't matter. Not here. Not in the real world. Action matters. Power matters. And I have both. He turned to the overseers. Lock him in the tool shed. No food, no water. We'll see how philosophical he feels after a few days. The punishment was meant to be cruel without being immediately fatal. Thomas couldn't simply execute Elijah now, not after Margaret's public intervention, not without evidence of actual wrongdoing, but he could make life unbearable. 2 overseers grabbed Elijah and dragged him to the shed. The door slammed shut, and darkness swallowed everything. He heard the bar drop into place, the lock click home. Then footsteps receding, voices fading. Alone. His eyes adjusted slowly. Thin light filtered through cracks in the walls. The shed smelled of wood shavings and metal, familiar scents that should have been comforting but instead felt like a coffin. He could stand, could pace in a small circle, but there was nowhere to go, nothing to do but wait. Hours passed. The heat built as the sun climbed, turning the shed into an oven. Sweat soaked through his clothes. His throat grew dry, then parched. He thought about the satchel hidden in the cabin, about the papers Margaret had given him, about Sarah and Grace in Alabama. He thought about what Margaret had said. Sometimes telling the truth is the only power you have left. By nightfall, his lips were cracked, his head pounding. He heard voices outside, slaves finishing their day's work, heading back to the quarters. Benjamin's voice, young and worried, "We should do something." Moses's reply, pragmatic and tired, "Do what? Get ourselves killed alongside him? But it ain't right. Nothing here is right. That's the whole damn point." Their voices faded. Darkness came complete. Elijah lay on the dirt floor and wondered if this was how he would die. Not from violence or disease, but from simple neglect. From being forgotten in a locked shed while the plantation went on without him. On the second day, he stopped feeling thirsty. That was a bad sign. He knew enough about the body to understand that when thirst stopped, the end was beginning. He drifted in and out of consciousness, dreams mixing with waking until he couldn't tell the difference. In one dream, Sarah stood in the doorway of the shed, Grace on her hip. "Get up," Sarah said. "This isn't how your story ends." "How does it end?" he asked. "However you choose." When he woke, the light had changed. Evening, he thought. Or maybe dawn again. He'd lost track of time. The door opened with a screech of hinges. Samuel stood silhouetted against the light, a water bucket in his hands. He said nothing, just set the bucket down and left, closing the door again. But he didn't lock it. The message was clear. The choice was Elijah's now. Drink and stay, accepting whatever came next, or leave. Run. Take the chance Margaret had tried to give him. Elijah crawled to the bucket and drank deeply, water cascading down his chin and chest. His body screamed for more, but he forced himself to stop, to think clearly. If he ran tonight, he had maybe 12 hours before Thomas organized a search. Less, if someone noticed the unlocked door. But if he stayed, more days in the shed awaited. Or worse, being sold south, deeper into the plantation south, where life expectancy for field slaves measured in years rather than decades. Where he'd never find Sarah and Grace, never have another chance. He waited until full dark, then slipped from the shed. The plantation was quiet, most slaves already asleep. He went to his cabin, retrieved the satchel from beneath the floorboards, and looked around at the men he'd lived with for years. Moses was awake, watching him. "You going?" "Yes." "Alabama's a long way. They'll hunt you." "I know." Moses nodded slowly. "Then go with God, brother. And if you make it, if you find them, tell them we're still here. Tell them we remember." Elijah slipped into the night, the satchel over his shoulder, Margaret's papers and money hidden inside. He headed north first, the opposite direction from Sarah and Grace, but also the direction no one would expect. He'd circle around later, make his way west and then south. It would take weeks, maybe months. But he had time now. He had choice. Behind him, the Whitmore plantation faded into darkness. Ahead, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human hope. He walked until dawn, until his legs gave out and he collapsed in a grove of trees. Sleep claimed him immediately, dreamless and deep. When he woke, the sun was high. He checked the satchel. The papers were still there, the money intact. He was still free. He didn't know if he would stay free. Didn't know if he'd ever reach Alabama, ever find Sarah and Grace. Didn't know if Margaret had made it to Charleston, if her documents would reach the abolitionists, if any of this would matter in the end. But he knew this. He had refused to be what Margaret needed him to be, had refused to let her loneliness become his destruction. And in that refusal, he'd given her a mirror to see herself clearly. She'd taken that clarity and turned it into action, imperfect, dangerous action, but action nonetheless. Two people trapped in different cages, using the only tools they had to crack the bars. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It was something harder and truer. Recognition of shared humanity in a system designed to deny it, and sometimes recognition was enough to change everything. Epilogue. Echo. 20 years later, in 1867, a man walked into a freedman's bureau office in Montgomery, Alabama. He carried papers yellowed with age, carefully preserved. The bureau worker, a young black woman named Esther who'd been born into freedom, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for my family." The man's hair was gray now, his face lined, but his eyes held steady. A woman named Sarah and a girl who would be grown now, Grace. They were sold here in 1844. Esther had heard this story 100 times since the war ended. Families torn apart, people searching for decades, hope worn thin as paper. But she took the yellow documents he offered and read through them carefully. "These records are remarkable," she said finally. "Most of the plantation ledgers were destroyed. How did you get these?" "A woman gave them to me. A white woman who decided to tell the truth, even though it cost her everything." Esther made notes, cross-referencing names and dates. "I can't promise anything, but I'll send inquiries to the other bureaus. If they're still alive, if they stayed in Alabama, we might be able to find them." "Thank you." He turned to leave, then paused. "The woman who gave me those papers, do you know what happened to her?" "What was her name?" "Margaret Whitmore." Esther's eyes widened. "The Boston abolitionist? The one who testified before Congress about plantation conditions?" "I don't know. We lost touch after she left." "She survived," Esther said. "Barely. Her family disowned her, called her insane, but she kept speaking, kept writing. They say she was one of the voices that helped turn Northern opinion against slavery. She died in 1863, just before the emancipation." The man nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Did she ever remarry?" "No. Apparently, she said she'd rather be alone with truth than partnered with lies." Esther smiled slightly. A lot of people thought she was crazy. Maybe she was. Or maybe she just saw clearly what others refused to see. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the bureau. A woman in Selma had come forward, claiming to be Grace. She remembered a father named Elijah, a carpenter, sold away when she was small. Her mother Sarah had died 5 years earlier, but not before making Grace promise to keep searching, keep hoping. When Elijah and Grace finally met, they stood facing each other in the bureau office, two strangers connected by blood and loss and the improbable survival of hope. Grace was 32 now, married, with children of her own. She barely remembered him, but she reached out tentatively and touched his face. "Mama said you had kind eyes. She said that's how she knew to trust you back when you first met." Elijah's vision blurred. She was right, about a lot of things. They didn't live happily ever after. That's not how these stories end. The scars ran too deep. The years apart had created people who barely knew each other. But they tried. They wrote letters, visited when they could. Grace's children grew up knowing their grandfather, hearing stories about a plantation and a night when a white woman's desperate loneliness collided with a black man's quiet dignity, and somehow that collision cracked open a space for truth. And truth, as Margaret had understood, was the only real power any of them had ever possessed. The story spread through the freedmen's communities, told and retold, until it became legend. Some versions made Margaret a saint, others a villain. Some painted Elijah as a hero, others as a fool. But the core remained. Two people trapped in an inhuman system, both refusing to let that system define the limits of their humanity. It wasn't a love story. It was something more important. A testimony to the possibility of recognition, of seeing each other truly despite every structure designed to prevent it. And in the end, that recognition had saved more than just 2 lives. It had preserved records, reunited families, provided evidence that helped bring justice. Not perfect justice, that was impossible. But the messy, incomplete, better-than-nothing justice that was all reconstruction could offer. The documents Margaret copied that night ended up in archives, studied by historians, used to trace family lines and restore identities. Her testimony before Congress, given despite threats and ridicule, helped shape the laws that would govern the rebuilding South. And Elijah's refusal, his quiet insistence on dignity despite having no power to enforce it, became a different kind of testimony. Evidence that even in slavery's darkest heart, humanity persisted, bent, scarred, nearly broken, but still present, still choosing when choice seemed impossible. In 1895, Grace's daughter published her grandfather's story in a small freedman's newspaper. She ended it with words Elijah had told her. "The master's wife asked me to stay, but the only freedom I ever found was in leaving. Not the plantation, but the idea that any of us, slave or free, black or white, could ever truly know each other while that system stood. She understood that, finally. And in understanding it, she helped to tear it down." The newspaper didn't reach many readers. But some stories don't need wide audiences. They just need to be true. And this one was.